They sat side by side on a quiet military flight, a Navy admiral proud and untouchable, and a janitor with tired eyes and a little girl asleep on his lap. When turbulence hit and she unknowingly fell asleep on his shoulder, she had no idea the man she leaned on once carried the call sign that shook the skies. What followed would change both their lives and the meaning of honor forever. Before we begin, if stories of quiet courage, kindness, and redemption touch your heart, we invite you to stay with our channel. Subscribe, share, and join us as we bring you more true-to-life tales that remind us sometimes the smallest act of kindness can change everything. Now let's begin the story. The morning wind over Naval Station Norfolk bit sharper than usual, the kind that cut through the seams of a uniform and whispered that winter was close. Admiral Laura Whitmore strode across the tarmac, her white dress uniform immaculate, her expression unreadable. Her aides followed 2 steps behind balancing briefcases and secure files, as if gravity depended on her pace. The flight wasn't on any official schedule. Not even her staff knew its full purpose. She preferred it that way. After 30 years in the Navy, 15 of them spent commanding ships, and the last 5 as the youngest female admiral in the Atlantic Fleet, Laura had learned that secrecy was the cleanest form of control. Today's mission was to Washington, D.C., a short flight, but a heavy one. She was to brief the Joint Chiefs about a maintenance lapse that had nearly cost lives during a classified operation. Someone had to be held accountable, and Laura had never hesitated to be that someone. Duty first. Always. She boarded the aircraft, a military transport converted for internal transfers. Inside the cabin had the chill of recycled air and the faint scent of metal polish. Rows of blue seats lined the aisle, and most were already filled with engineers, logistics, officers, and base workers. A flight meant to blend ranks, she thought. Efficient, but inconvenient. She took her assigned seat mid-cabin, pressed her briefcase beneath the chair, and unbuttoned the top of her coat. Just one quiet flight. That was all she wanted. Moments later, a man stepped on board with a small girl clinging to his side. His clothes didn't match the crisp uniforms around him. An olive maintenance jacket, faded jeans, and boots scuffed to their second life. His hair was long, brushed back carelessly, but his movements were calm, practiced. The child, 5, maybe 6, had bright chestnut hair and a red cotton dress that stood out like a flame against the gray morning. They moved slowly down the aisle, apologizing as they passed. Laura caught herself watching. The man smiled at the steward, adjusted the strap of a small backpack, and nodded toward their row. Seats 14B and 14C, he murmured, voice deep and polite. Her eyes dropped to her boarding stub. 14A. He looked up, meeting her gaze for the first time. Looks like we're seatmates, ma'am. Apparently, she replied, her tone neutral. He helped his daughter climb into her seat before settling beside Laura. The little girl looked around with wide eyes, the way children do when they still believe every cloud has a secret inside it. Daddy, we're flying really high, right? Yeah, sweetheart, he said softly. High enough to see where angels nap. Laura almost smiled at that, but stopped herself. Discipline. Distance. She opened her folder and began reviewing maintenance reports, though her mind drifted back to the man's voice. There was something steady about it, something that didn't belong to someone merely sweeping hangar floors. When the engines hummed alive, the cabin shuddered lightly. The girl gasped and held her father's arm. He whispered something to calm her, rubbing gentle circles on her back. Laura glimpsed their reflection in the small window, a picture of quiet tenderness, father and daughter, framed in silver daylight. 15 minutes into the flight, the girl spilled her orange juice. It splashed onto Laura's polished shoes. Oh no, she squeaked. I'm sorry. Laura blinked, surprised not by the mess, but by how fast the man reacted. He knelt, pulled a cloth from his pocket and wiped the floor clean in one efficient motion. "Please don't worry," Laura said, her voice softer than she expected. He looked up. Still, I should have seen it coming. Planes and juice boxes never mix. The corner of her mouth twitched. Humor on a military flight. How unusual. He leaned back, giving her space. She gets nervous on takeoff. I'll keep a tighter lid next time. "What's her name, Lily?" he said, glancing at the little girl who was now shyly peeking over her armrest. "She's 6, loves airplanes, but hates turbulence." "Bit ironic, huh?" Very Laura said. The engines steadied into their mid-flight rhythm, a lullaby of machinery. The cabin dimmed as the crew lowered the lights. One by one, passengers surrendered to exhaustion. Laura tried to stay awake, but the week had been long: inspectors' paperwork, political calls. Her eyelids grew heavy despite herself. She caught the faint scent of detergent and engine oil the man's jacket, and before she realized it, her head tilted slightly, resting against something solid. Mike Reynolds froze. He had been staring out the window, lost in thoughts of bills and bedtime stories, when the weight of her head touched his shoulder. A Navy Admiral, he could tell by the stripes, leaning against him like a weary soul. His first instinct was to move, to straighten, and wake her gently. But something stopped him. Maybe it was the way her breathing slowed, or how the harshness left her face once she closed her eyes. So he sat, still, barely daring to breathe, while his daughter slept, curled against his other arm. For the first time in years, between the two people he loved and respected, most a child and a stranger, Mike felt peace. When Laura woke, the first thing she noticed was warmth. Her head rested on his shoulder, and her hand had slipped near his forearm. Embarrassment rushed up her spine. "Oh God," she stammered, sitting upright. "I'm so sorry." He smiled, slow and unbothered. "Don't worry about it. You looked like you needed the nap." "That's hardly professional," she muttered, adjusting her collar. "Even admirals are human sometimes," he said simply. She glanced at him, startled by the gentleness in his tone. It wasn't patronizing. It was understanding. "I didn't realize I fell asleep," she said. "Yeah," he replied, looking out the window. "Long week?" "Every week is long." He chuckled quietly. "Then you're doing something important." Silence lingered between them, not awkward, but delicate. She studied him more closely now, the faint lines near his eyes, the posture of a man who'd known command yet carried no pride. There was grace in his humility, something almost military in the precision of his movements. She wanted to ask what he did, but stopped herself. Rank had boundaries. Instead, she said, "Thank you for not waking me." He shrugged. "Sometimes the kindest thing you can do for someone is to let them rest." Laura turned toward the window, pretending to focus on the clouds, but the words stayed with her, echoing like a memory she hadn't lived yet. As the aircraft cut through the high sky, the Admiral and the janitor sat shoulder to shoulder, unaware that this small moment of quiet kindness was the first tremor of something far greater, waiting beyond the clouds. The engines hummed steadily as the plane sliced through the mid-morning clouds, leaving behind a thin white trail that shimmered in the sunlight. Inside the cabin, the world had fallen into a rare calm. Voices softened to murmurs, lights dimmed, and the rhythmic vibration of flight worked its quiet hypnosis on every soul aboard. Admiral Laura Whitmore sat upright now, fully awake, though a hint of color still lingered on her cheeks. She had slept on a stranger's shoulder, no less, and the thought unsettled her in ways she couldn't quite name. She'd faced typhoons and tribunals without flinching, yet one accidental nap on a man's shoulder made her heartbeat stumble. She adjusted her uniform and glanced to her right. The man, Mike Reynolds, as she'd soon overhear, was reading a worn-out paperback, the kind soldiers used to tuck into their rucksacks. His daughter, Lily, sat on his lap, coloring in a small notebook with the seriousness of a cadet on parade. Her tongue peeked out slightly as she filled each shape, whispering names to her drawings. "Who's that?" Laura asked before she could stop herself. Lily turned the book around proud. "That's Daddy and me. We're flying in a big airplane." "You're in it too," she added, eyes sparkling. Laura blinked. "I'm in it, The little girl pointed to a figure in white uniform. "You were sleeping." Daddy said sometimes people get tired when they take care of everyone else. Mike looked up, half smiling, half mortified. "Lily," he murmured, "remember what I said about personal stories?" The girl frowned. "But it's a nice story." Laura laughed softly. "It is. And your dad's right sometimes. People do get tired when they're responsible for others." She hesitated, her gaze softening. "But that's a good kind of tired." Mike met her eyes briefly, a quiet acknowledgement passing between them. For a moment, neither rank nor uniform existed, only two parents navigating the long road between duty and love. A tremor rippled through the plane. Nothing dangerous, just a hiccup in the air currents. The fastened seatbelt light flickered on. Lily gasped and clutched her father's arm. "It's okay, sweetheart," he said calmly, his voice low and steady. "Just a little bump in the sky. Happens all the time." She buried her face in his shoulder. "I don't like bumps. I know." He brushed her hair back gently. "How about we count to 10 together? That always helps. 1, 2. Laura watched him as they counted softly, the deep timbre of his voice, smoothing the fear in the child's eyes. There was something almost sacred in the gentleness of it, the kind of tenderness she rarely saw anymore among men hardened by service. When the turbulence eased, Lily drifted back to sleep, her small hand curled around his finger. Mike settled back, careful not to move. His eyes, when they lifted to Laura's, held a flicker of apology. "Sorry about that. She's braver than she thinks, but flying still makes her nervous." "You handled it well," Laura said quietly. "You have. A steady presence." He shrugged, a humble motion. "Comes with the job, I guess." "And what job is that?" He hesitated, studying the window. "Maintenance crew. I clean hangars, fix what's broken, sometimes wash the decks. The kind of work that keeps the place running without anyone noticing." There was no bitterness in his tone, just simple truth. Laura's instinct was to nod politely and move on the way admirals did when enlisted men spoke about small lives. But something in the way he said, without anyone noticing, struck a chord. She'd built her career on being noticed, awards, citations, headlines, and yet sitting beside this man, she wondered when was the last time she'd done something, simply because it was right, not because it was recorded. "Your daughter," she said softly. "She must be proud of you." He smiled faintly. "She thinks I'm a superhero. I let her keep believing that for now." "That's not lying," Laura replied, surprising herself. "It's love." He looked at her. Really looked. Eyes calm, unreadable, yet somehow knowing. Maybe so. For a long moment they sat in comfortable silence. Laura tried to return to her paperwork, but her focus slipped. Her mind replayed the sensation of his shoulder earlier, the warmth, the stillness, the safety she hadn't felt in years. She, who had commanded fleets, felt safe leaning on a janitor. The irony made her lips curl into a reluctant smile. A voice crackled over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're approaching a minor weather front. Please remain seated." Outside, the clouds had thickened into a soft gray sea. Raindrops streaked across the windows like melting stars. Lily stirred, half awake. "Daddy," she mumbled. "Are we gonna crash?" Mike chuckled quietly. "Not a chance. These planes are tougher than me after a bad cup of coffee." That made her giggle, the sound brightening the cabin, like sunlight through storm clouds. Even Laura smiled, and when Lily noticed, she leaned over. You're smiling. Daddy says smiles make storms smaller. Laura laughed, a sound that startled her as much as it pleased the girl. Your daddy's a wise man. Mike shook his head. I'm just making it up as I go. Most of us are, Laura said. He tilted his head. Even admirals, especially admirals, she admitted. They both laughed softly. The sound blended with the hum of the engines, a rare harmony in a world built on hierarchy and rules. The plane steadied again, breaking through the edge of the weather. Through the clearing clouds, sunlight poured in brilliant golden, the kind that makes everything feel temporarily forgiven. Mike adjusted the blanket over his daughter's lap. His movements were careful, deliberate, as though every gesture carried quiet reverence. Laura found herself studying the calluses on his hands, the faint scars across his knuckles. These were not the hands of a janitor alone. They were the hands of someone who had built, repaired, protected. When he caught her gaze, she looked away quickly, but he didn't seem embarrassed, only patient, as if he understood that she wasn't really looking at him, but at the reflection of something she'd lost. After a while, she asked, "Do you fly often?" "Not anymore," he said. "Used to a long time ago. These days, I stick to the ground." There was a weight in those words, one she felt instinctively not to press. Instead, she said, "Sometimes the ground is more dangerous." He smiled faintly. "You'd be surprised how true that is." The conversation dwindled, but the silence between them was no longer cold. It had the warmth of understanding, the kind that needs no words. Laura looked out the window again. The horizon glowed orange, now streaked with soft lavender light. She thought about the reports waiting on her desk, the endless meetings, the polished smiles that hid sharp edges. And then she thought about this moment, this small, ordinary kindness from a man who should have been invisible to her rank, and realized it felt more real than anything she'd done in years. When the flight attendant came by with coffee, Mike ordered one black, then turned to her. "You want one, Admiral?" She hesitated. "How did you?" He nodded toward her insignia, kind of hard to miss. She smiled, a little self-conscious. "I suppose it is." He handed her the cup anyway. "You looked like you needed it more than I did." Laura accepted it, fingers brushing his briefly. "Thank you, Mr. Reynolds," he said. Mike Reynolds. Something about the name echoed faintly in the back of her mind, like a distant chord she couldn't yet place. But she let it go for now. As the plane began its descent toward Washington, Laura found herself oddly reluctant for the flight to end. The world outside those cabin walls waited with its orders and protocols and expectations. But here, at 30,000 feet, she had discovered something she hadn't known. She was missing a glimpse of gentleness, a reminder that even the strongest uniform could rest on a shoulder of quiet kindness. She turned to him just before landing. "You're good with people, Mr. Reynolds." He smiled without looking up. "Not people. Just those who still believe in goodness." The wheels touched down with a soft thud, but in Laura's chest, something else had just taken flight. Washington's light fell thin and metallic through the aircraft windows as passengers began to stir. The seatbelt sign blinked off, and the cabin filled with the soft chaos of people reclaiming their lives, phones powering on luggage, thudding from overhead bins, voices rising like surf after a long calm. Admiral Laura Whitmore stayed seated, waiting for the aisle to clear. She was used to waiting. Discipline had taught her that the patient eye sees more than the hurried one. Across from her, Mike Reynolds gathered his daughter's small backpack and folded her blanket with the quiet precision of a man who'd spent years respecting order, even when the world no longer required it. Lily yawned, rubbing her eyes. "Daddy, are we there yet?" "We are, kiddo." He smiled and tapped her nose. Back on solid ground. Laura found herself smiling again before she could stop it. There was something so simple, so uncomplicated about their bond. that it tugged at a part of her she rarely visited anymore. The intercom chimed. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Washington, D.C. Please remain seated until the seatbelt sign is turned off." Laura reached for her briefcase, the polished brass latch clicking open like a reflex. Her fingers brushed against classified documents, travel orders, and the thin leather folder that dictated the next 72 hours of her life. Duty discipline, command everything she'd built her identity around, waited just outside that cabin door. And yet, she glanced at the father and daughter beside her, and an unfamiliar thought slipped through the cracks of her armor. Maybe the most disciplined heart is the one that knows when to soften. When the doors opened, passengers shuffled out in polite disorder. Laura stood stepping aside to let the man and his daughter pass first. "After you," she said quietly. Mike looked surprised. "Admiral's privilege comes first." "Not today," she replied. "Today I'm just another passenger." He gave a respectful nod, adjusting the strap of Lily's backpack. "Then thank you, Mom." The three of them walked down the narrow aisle together. Outside, the air was colder, sharper. The terminal smelled of coffee jet fuel and hurried goodbyes. People streamed past them, their movements efficient and impersonal. Lily's small hand slipped into her father's, and she looked up at Laura. "You coming with us?" The question startled Laura. "Oh, I know, I have a meeting." The little girl nodded solemnly. "That's okay. Daddy says people who work hard keep the world from falling apart." Laura looked at Mike. He chuckled, rubbing the back of his neck. "She listens too much." "She listens well," Laura corrected gently. For a moment, the world seemed to hold still, the hum of luggage wheels, the murmur of announcements, all fading under the quiet pulse of connection. Then duty reasserted itself like gravity. Laura glanced at her watch. "I should go." "Of course," Mike said. "Thanks for being kind to Lily." "Not everyone is. Kindness doesn't require rank," she said, then paused. "Take care, Mr. Reynolds." He nodded, and she turned to leave her steps brisk and measured once more. But she felt his gaze linger steady, respectful, unspoken. Outside, Laura's government vehicle was waiting. The driver saluted as she entered. The door closed, sealing her again, in the quiet luxury of command-polished leather, faint scent of gun oil, and the ever-present hum of security radios. "Pentagon, ma'am." "Yes," she replied. As the car merged into traffic, she looked out the window. In the flow of commuters, she spotted a familiar shape. A man and a little girl crossing the street toward the bus station. Lily clutched a paper cup of hot chocolate steam swirling in the cold air. Mike held her hand, matching his pace to hers, saying something that made her laugh out loud. Laura didn't realize she was smiling until her reflection caught her. For an instant, she saw not the Admiral, but the woman beneath the medals, tired, human, and oddly longing. The Pentagon was its usual symphony of order, boots, echoing in perfect rhythm walls, whispering secrets no one dared speak aloud. Laura stepped into her office, the one with the sweeping view of the Potomac and the framed commendations that lined the wall like silent witnesses. Her aide, Commander Ellis, entered moments later with fresh reports. "Ma'am, your 0900 briefing with the Joint Chiefs has been confirmed. Also, Captain Ramirez is waiting outside for debrief. Send him in after I review this," Laura said, sliding the folder open. Numbers, signatures, operations, each line a brick in the fortress she'd built between herself and the world. Yet her mind kept drifting back to the softness of a child's voice, the calm in a janitor's eyes, the warmth of a stranger's shoulder. "Focus," she whispered under her breath, irritated at her own distraction. But even as she tried to bury it under layers of protocol, something inside her shifted. Across town, Mike sat on a bench at the small park near the maintenance quarters. Lily chased pigeons with uncontained joy, her laughter echoing between the rows of leafless trees. Mike watched her sipping coffee from a paper cup. The world felt slower here, less polished, but more honest. He had grown used to invisibility. Janitors weren't noticed, and that was fine. There was peace in blending into the background, in being the one who cleaned the footprints, others left behind. But today was different. There had been something in the Admiral's eyes, sharp, but not cruel, disciplined, yet almost lonely. He'd seen that look before years ago in the mirror of a pilot's quarters before deployment. A look that said the mission matters, but who am I without it? He reached into his jacket pocket, pulling out his old watch, a scratched silver piece with an inscription worn from years of sweat and dust. Captain M. Reynolds, 33rd Squadron. He turned it over in his hand, thumb brushing the letters. A relic from another life. Daddy Lily called running back with a feather in her hand. "Look what I found." He smiled. "That's a good one. Keep it safe. Can I give it to the nice lady from the plane?" His breath caught for half a second. "Maybe someday, kiddo." She nodded, content with that answer. That evening, as night fell over D.C., Laura stood by her window, watching the city lights flicker like distant fires on calm water. Her reflection merged with the view, a silhouette wrapped in metals and loneliness. She tried to read, to plan to work, but her mind refused to settle. Instead, it replayed the small, unguarded moments of that flight, the spilled juice, the gentle hands, the little girl's laughter, and her own uncharacteristic smile. "Get a hold of yourself," she muttered, yet the reprimand felt hollow. Duty had been her compass all her life. But for the first time in years, she wondered if somewhere along the way she had confused duty with distance. She turned off the light, leaving her office in darkness, except for the glow of the city beyond the glass. In that reflection, she didn't see a leader. She saw a woman who had slept on a stranger's shoulder, and for a fleeting moment, remembered what it felt like to trust someone without question. Two worlds apart, one forged by power, the other by humility, had crossed at 30,000 feet. And though she didn't know it yet, neither of them would ever return to the sky quite the same again. The next morning, Washington woke beneath a curtain of soft rain. It blurred the skyline and made every building look like a ghost of itself, familiar yet distant. Inside the Pentagon, where precision ruled over poetry, Admiral Laura Whitmore stood in the operations briefing room, her posture as straight as the American flag behind her. Admiral Whitmore, final authorization on the re-evaluation of the 33rd Squadron disciplinary files, asked Commander Ellis, holding a clipboard. Laura signed it with a steady hand. Her voice was crisp, measured, the kind that cut through hesitation like a blade through fog. Approved, effective immediately. But as the pen left the page, something inside her tightened. The 33rd Squadron. She hadn't spoken those words aloud in years. And yet, as if fate had been listening, the name found her again this time, not in a report, but on a silver watch worn by a man whose daughter had offered her a drawing on a quiet flight. Hours earlier, she had boarded another aircraft, a smaller one this time, a routine shuttle heading back toward the Norfolk base, where the maintenance teams were stationed. The rain streaked along the window, steady as memory. She had told herself it was coincidence, that she was only following up on the inspection protocol. But the truth, the kind she never said aloud, was that she wanted to see him again, to understand why his name, his quiet voice, and his calm eyes refused to leave her mind. Inside the cabin, Mike Reynolds sat a few rows ahead, his olive jacket slightly damp, his daughter reading from a picture book. Lily's laughter filled the narrow space light, and pure against the steady drone of the engines. When she spotted Laura boarding, her face lit up. "It's the lady from the airplane." Mike turned. Their eyes met for the first time since Washington. Laura smiled just enough to soften the air. "Good morning, Miss Lily." Lily grinned. "Daddy said we might see you again. He said good people always cross paths twice." Mike cleared his throat, embarrassed. "I might have said that." Laura sat across the aisle, her briefcase balanced neatly on her knees. "It's a wise thought, Mr. Reynolds." "Not mine, originally," he said, settling back in his seat. "Borrowed it from an old instructor." She tilted her head. "You were in the service." He hesitated. The engines filled the silence before he finally said, "A long time ago. Feels like another lifetime." Something flickered across his face, a mix of pride and pain, and Laura felt an ache in her chest she didn't quite understand. The flight was smooth until it wasn't. A sudden burst of turbulence jolted the cabin. The seatbelt sign flashed red, and the plane dropped a few hundred feet before leveling again. Lily squealed and clutched her father's arm. Laura reached out instinctively, steadying the cup on his tray before it could spill. Their hands brushed just a moment, warm, real human, and then the plane steadied. "Easy, sweetheart," Mike whispered to his daughter. "Just the wind, saying hello." Laura exhaled, realizing she'd been holding her breath. "You're remarkably calm for someone who hates flying." "I don't hate flying," he said quietly. "I just stopped doing it." Something in his tone, gentle, almost mournful, pulled at her. "Stopped." He looked out the window where the clouds rolled like waves. Some skies aren't meant to be revisited. Before she could ask, Lily tugged at his sleeve. "Daddy, can I draw the clouds?" "Of course, kiddo," he said. "But make them happy ones this time." Laura smiled faintly at the exchange, though her thoughts churned. Some skies aren't meant to be revisited. She leaned back, eyes drawn to the silver glint on his wrist, the same old watch she'd noticed before. It caught the overhead light flashing briefly. Her breath caught. The engraving. Captain M. Reynolds, 33rd Squadron. For a second, the hum of the plane disappeared. Time rewound sharp and unforgiving. 5 years ago. A classified mission over hostile territory. An unauthorized maneuver that saved a group of stranded engineers but violated direct orders. And her own signature black ink across the disciplinary order, ending the career of one of the most promising pilots in the fleet. The name she had signed that day, Captain Michael Reynolds, had haunted the margins of her conscience ever since. Now he was sitting less than 10 feet away, wiping his daughter's sticky fingers, oblivious to the fact that the woman who had once stripped him of his wings was watching him with guilt curdling beneath her composure. Laura felt her pulse quicken. She turned toward the window, the reflection of her face merging with his silhouette in the glass. Every instinct screamed to maintain silence, to let this coincidence dissolve into anonymity. But her heart, that stubborn piece of her, she had trained to obey. Reason whispered otherwise. When the plane touched down at Norfolk, she waited until most passengers had left. Mike helped Lily with her coat, his movements unhurried. "Mr. Reynolds," she began, her voice quieter than usual, "if you don't mind my asking. Were you ever stationed at Langley?" He froze just for a breath. "Once, yeah. A long time ago." Why'd you held his gaze. "You were a pilot." He hesitated. "Used to be. Not anymore." "Why not?" She pressed gently, though her throat tightened around the words. He looked at her, then really looked, and for the first time, she saw the trace of what he carried behind his calm exterior. "Because some mistakes cost you your wings, Admiral," he said softly. "Even when they save lives." Her heart dropped. The words were simple, but they hit with the precision of a missile. He knew. Lily tugged at his sleeve. "Daddy, come on. We'll be late." He nodded and gave Laura a small, polite smile, the kind one offers a stranger, not an enemy. "It was good to see you again, ma'am. Take care." And then he was gone, walking hand in hand with his daughter into the rain, his boots leaving dark prints on the wet pavement. Laura stood frozen by the aircraft door, watching them disappear into the mist. Her aide approached. "Admiral, your car is ready." She nodded absently, but her voice came from somewhere far away. "I'll be right there." When she finally turned to leave, the world around her felt slightly off balance, as if gravity itself had shifted. She who had prided herself on judgment, discipline, and flawless adherence to protocol had just discovered that the man she had condemned still carried himself with quiet dignity. And worse, he carried no bitterness toward her. The guilt she had buried beneath medals and citations rose like tidewater. For the first time in years, Admiral Laura Whitmore didn't know what order to give herself next. That night, alone in her quarters, she placed her hat on the table and stared at her reflection in the dark window. The rain had turned to mist, and beyond it, faint lights blinked along the runway. Somewhere out there, the man she'd once punished was probably putting his daughter to bed, reading her a story in that steady voice that could calm any storm. Laura pressed her hand against the glass and whispered the words she'd never said to anyone. I was wrong. The city outside remained silent, but in the distance, a single aircraft took off its roar, echoing across the night sky, like the sound of forgiveness she wasn't sure she deserved. Rain came and went in thin silver sheets over Norfolk, washing the tarmac into a mirror of light. The day should have felt routine. Meetings, reports, inspections. But for Admiral Laura Whitmore, nothing about her world felt steady anymore. She sat at her office desk, elbows on the mahogany surface, fingers pressed to her temples. The room around her, the flags, the framed commendations. The faint hum of the ventilation suddenly felt smaller than usual, as if the walls themselves knew her secret. Every file she opened blurred into the same memory, a cockpit aflame, a young pilot's voice breaking through the radio, the words, "I had to go back for them, ma'am." They were alive. And then the official report that followed the one she'd signed with unwavering confidence. Captain Michael Reynolds, disobedience of direct order, termination of commission. Laura exhaled slowly, her chest tight. She had convinced herself for years that it was the right decision, that rules were sacred and structure held the military together. But now, after seeing the man in person, calm, kind, unbroken, those old justifications rang hollow. She had ruined his career, and somehow he had forgiven her before she'd even asked. That afternoon, she attended a strategic review session with senior officers. The room buzzed with clipped voices and the sterile precision of command. Charts lit up the wall supply routes, fleet readiness, maintenance protocols. Admiral Whitmore, a colonel, prompted. "We've confirmed that base morale is up 7% since your last inspection." She nodded absently. "Good." But her thoughts were elsewhere, on a man in a maintenance jacket who cleaned hangar floors without complaint. A man who had once flown through fire to save lives and had lost everything for it. Her aide, Commander Ellis, noticed her distraction. "Ma'am, are you all right?" Laura straightened. "Perfectly fine, Commander." The room fell silent. They believed her, of course they did. Her voice, her posture, her authority, all of it built to hide doubt. Yet beneath the uniform, her heart beat like something out of rhythm. When the meeting adjourned, she dismissed everyone early. As the last officer left, she stayed behind, staring at the dark window, until her reflection blurred. Finally, she whispered the truth into the empty room. "I was wrong about him." 2 miles away, Mike Reynolds knelt beside his daughter's bed, tucking in the corners of her blanket. The small quarters smelled faintly of soap and engine oil, the scent that clung to everything in the maintenance wing. "Daddy, tell me the sky story again," Lily murmured sleepily. He smiled. "You've heard that one 100 times." "I like it." He brushed a strand of hair from her forehead and began in that calm, steady voice that made every story sound true. Once upon a time, there was a pilot who loved the sky more than anything. But one day, he learned that flying isn't about being above people. It's about carrying them safely home. Her eyes were already half closed. Did he get to fly again? Mike hesitated. Not yet. But sometimes when he fixes planes, he can still hear the sky calling his name. Lily smiled faintly, drifting into dreams. He sat there for a moment longer, listening to her soft breathing, the one sound that kept him anchored to the earth. Then quietly, he whispered something only the night could hear. She wouldn't remember me, kiddo. People like her don't look back. But deep down, he knew he was lying to himself. The look in Admiral Whitmore's eyes on that last flight, something between recognition and remorse, had lingered longer than he wanted to admit. The next morning, Laura arrived at the base unannounced. Her driver raised an eyebrow, but didn't question her order. Admirals didn't explain themselves. She walked through the maintenance hangar alone, her heels echoing across the concrete floor. The smell of jet fuel hung thick in the air, mingling with the metallic tang of oil and the faint hiss of hydraulic lines. Everywhere she looked, sailors and technicians moved with precision, focused, efficient, anonymous. And then among them, she saw him. Mike was crouched beside an A-10 Thunderbolt hands, stained with grease, tightening a panel bolt with the same calm focus she remembered from the flight. The plane's shark-toothed nose gleamed under the hangar lights, a relic of the same model he had once flown. He looked up as she approached, surprise flickering across his features, before settling into composure. Admiral. He wiped his hands on a rag and stood. Didn't expect to see you here. Neither did I, she admitted. There was a long silence between them, filled with the distant hum of engines. I owe you an apology, she said finally, her voice quieter than the hangar deserved. 5 years ago, I signed a report that ended your career. I believed it was the right thing to do. I was wrong. Mike looked at her for a long moment, his face unreadable. Then he sighed. Ma'am, you don't owe me anything. Yes, I do. He shook his head. You made the call you thought was right. That's what command means. Someone has to bear the weight. And what about the weight I left you with? She asked softly. For the first time, he hesitated. I carried it. Then I learned to let it go. She wanted to say something more to explain the guilt that had hollowed her out, but before she could, Lily's voice echoed from the far end of the hangar. Daddy. The girl ran toward them, clutching a small lunchbox. Mike crouched to meet her, his entire expression transforming in an instant, from stoic to tender, from soldier to father. Hey, sweetheart. What are you doing here? I told Mrs. Daniels I wanted to eat with you, Lily said proudly. She said, admirals eat with presidents, but I said admirals can eat with janitors too. Laura froze. Mike tried not to laugh. She's learning diplomacy. Laura smiled despite herself. I'd say she's learning honesty. Lily turned to her. You can eat with us too if you want. Laura looked at the child, then at the man, then down at her perfectly pressed uniform. She hadn't shared a meal outside of protocol in years. I'd like that, she said. Finally. They sat on a crate near the maintenance line, sharing sandwiches and laughter that didn't need rank to exist. For a while, the world outside the hangar, its medals, its orders, its ghosts faded into silence. When lunch ended, Laura stood. Mr. Reynolds, she said formally, though her voice trembled slightly. If you ever wish to return to active status, I can initiate a review. There are ways, unofficial ones, to correct past errors. He looked at her steadily. Thank you, ma'am. But I think I've found my place. Cleaning hangars, raising Lily, he corrected gently. Keeping planes flying, even if I'm not the one in the cockpit. That's enough for me. She nodded, slowly understanding. You've done more for this uniform than you'll ever be credited for. Maybe, he said. But credit's never what made me fly. Laura turned to leave her heart heavier, yet strangely lighter. At the door, she glanced back. Mike was lifting Lily into his arms, spinning her once, as she laughed a sound that rose above the hum of engines, like music. For years, Laura had believed honor came from obedience, from never faltering, never bending. But as she watched that simple act of joy, she realized something profound. Perhaps honor wasn't about following orders at all. Perhaps it was about forgiveness for others and for oneself. That night, back in her quarters, she opened her old logbook. The final page still bore her signature under his name. With a deep breath, she picked up a pen and wrote beneath it, "Amendment decision under review." Subject demonstrated exceptional courage beyond command parameters. Her handwriting wavered, but her resolve did not. For the first time in years, Admiral Laura Whitmore felt the weight begin to lift. The storm had passed over Norfolk, but the air still held the taste of salt and electricity. Admiral Laura Whitmore sat alone in her office long after midnight, the desk lamp casting a pool of amber light across a stack of classified files. The building was quiet now, too quiet, and in that silence, every tick of the wall clock sounded like an accusation. On the top of the pile lay a faded manila folder, stamped, Restricted 33rd Squadron Disciplinary File. Captain, Michael Reynolds. Her hand trembled slightly as she opened it. The smell of paper and dust filled the air. The first page stared back at her like an old wound. Charges disobedience of direct order during Operation Cerberus. Result termination of commission. Dishonorable discharge avoided by officer's request for voluntary resignation. She read her own signature at the bottom, precise and merciless. At the time, it had seemed simple. He had violated orders in a live combat zone, turned back against protocol, to save a civilian engineering team trapped under fire. Her decision had been guided by everything the Navy drilled into her, the chain of command, the supremacy of orders, the cold arithmetic of war. But now, after seeing him again, his quiet dignity, his tenderness toward his daughter, his peace, her certainty cracked. The file no longer felt like justice. It felt like betrayal dressed in regulation. Laura turned the pages slowly. The after-action reports painted a different story when read through human eyes rather than military eyes. Captain Reynolds's unauthorized return to Zone Echo saved the lives of 5 personnel. Action disobeyed command directive but prevented total loss of engineering convoy. Subject displayed exceptional situational awareness and disregard for personal safety. There it was in sterile bureaucratic prose, the truth that had never reached daylight. Her chest ached. How many times had she read this before without seeing it? She flipped to the appended witness statements written in cramped handwriting. A corporal, a technician, a field medic. Their words shared one refrain. He came back for us. One line from the medic caught her eye. When the fire hit, we thought it was over. Then the A-10 came out of nowhere. The pilot's voice on comms said, "Hold on, I've got you." I didn't know his name then, but I'll never forget his voice. Laura leaned back in her chair, her eyes burning. That voice. Calm, measured, grounded. The same voice that had soothed a frightened child on a civilian flight. The same man she had reduced to a footnote in a disciplinary record. She closed her eyes. You thought you were protecting the system. But the system forgot the man. The next morning, she walked into the Pentagon with a sense of purpose she hadn't felt in years. Her heels clicked sharply on the marble floors as officers turned to salute, unaware that behind her crisp uniform, something inside her had already shifted. "Commander Ellis," she said, stopping by her aide's desk, "I need authorization to access archived field data from Operation Cerberus, classified drone logs, comm records, everything." He blinked. "Ma'am, that mission's been closed for 5 years. Then it's time to reopen it." He hesitated, reading the conviction in her eyes. "Understood, Admiral." Hours later, the room was filled with screens, maps, audio files, tactical footage. The digital ghosts of the mission replayed in cold precision. Through the static, she heard it. Eagle Command. This is Captain Reynolds' 33rd Squadron. Civilian engineers still alive at coordinates Echo 7. Request immediate authorization to extract. Negative, Captain. Stand down. The area is compromised. Abort and return to base. A pause. With respect, sir. If I don't go now, they'll die. Then the sound of engines roaring gunfire and the crackle of comm interference. Finally, the line went dead. Laura closed her eyes. She could almost see it, the battered A-10 smoke trailing from its wings, diving through enemy fire to shield unarmed men and women. And the man in the cockpit calm to his final breath, choosing humanity over command. Later that evening, she sought out one of the survivors listed in the report, Chief Petty Officer Harold Vance, now retired, and running a small mechanic shop outside Norfolk. The bell above the door jingled when she entered. The place smelled of motor oil and coffee. Vance looked up from a carburetor, eyes widening. Admiral Whitmore. Ma'am, what brings you? I'm here about Operation Cerberus, she interrupted softly. And about Captain Reynolds. The man froze, wrench in hand. Haven't heard that name in a long time. Tell me what happened that day, she said. Vance sighed, wiping his hands on a rag. We were pinned down, ma'am. Enemy drones had us locked. Our comms went dark. We knew no one was coming back. He paused, voice thickening. Then he did. Came in low, damn near scraping the ground. Took out the whole defense line. Bought us just enough time to reach the evac point. Plane was on fire, but he stayed with it till we were safe. Only then did he eject. Laura swallowed hard. You wrote a statement? Yeah. Never got a reply. Word was command buried it. I was command, she said quietly. And I buried it. Vance studied her for a long moment. You were just doing your job, ma'am. No, she said. I was protecting my career. He was protecting lives. The mechanic nodded slowly. If you're reopening the case, you'll need all of us. We'd testify again. Hell, we'd fly to D.C. if we had to. Laura extended her hand. You won't have to. I'll bring the case to them. That night, back in her quarters, she drafted a new report. Every word felt like penance. Subject review of prior disciplinary action. Captain Michael Reynolds' recommendation. Immediate reconsideration of charges. Evidence indicates actions aligned with Navy core values, courage, commitment, and honor. Admiral's note. In war, obedience sustains order, but humanity sustains the soul of service. Captain Reynolds chose both. History should reflect that. When she finished, she signed her name again, but this time the ink felt lighter. Outside her window, dawn crept over the horizon. The sky over Norfolk glowed pale gold, and for the first time in years, Laura felt the faintest sense of peace. Across the base, in a small apartment above the maintenance hangar, Mike Reynolds was waking his daughter for school. He didn't know that miles away an admiral he once thought untouchable had spent the night rewriting the story of his life. Laura watched the first rays of sunlight spill across her desk, illuminating the old folder, now resting beside the new one. Two histories side by side, one written in rules, the other in redemption. She smiled faintly and whispered to herself, "Let's set this right." The early dawn rolled across the Chesapeake like a breath of forgiveness, painting the hangars in muted gold. Inside the main administrative building, Admiral Laura Whitmore sat in a war room that had hosted generations of commanders, men who had made decisions that carved their names into the iron of history. But this morning, she wasn't here to defend old orders. She was here to correct one. Stacks of declassified documents were spread across the table. Mission logs, satellite telemetry, witness statements, transcripts. all of them converged into one undeniable truth. Captain Michael Reynolds had done the right thing. He had saved lives, not disobeyed duty. Laura had spent her life believing in hierarchy, precision, law. Yet somewhere between the lines of command, she had forgotten the thing that had drawn her to service in the first place, the belief that courage, not compliance, defined a soldier's heart. Now at last, she intended to make it right. By mid-morning, she was on the move, her aide, Commander Ellis, trying to keep up with her long strides down the corridor. "Admiral," he said, clutching a file, "you've already sent the formal request for review. Are you sure you want to escalate this to the Board of Honors?" Laura didn't break stride. "I'm not escalating it. I'm finishing it. Ma'am, the board won't appreciate having a case reopened without precedent." She stopped, turned, and fixed him with a look that reminded him why she'd made Admiral before 50. "Precedent exists to serve justice, Commander, not to suffocate it." Ellis straightened his tie. "Understood, ma'am." She softened her tone. "Get me the list of survivors from Operation Cerberus. Every one of them." Within hours, she had names, phone numbers, and addresses. 5 people. 5 lives that still breathed because of one man's disobedience. The first was Chief Harold Vance, the mechanic she'd already spoken to. When she called him again, he didn't hesitate. "You get me in front of that board, Admiral, and I'll tell them the truth till they choke on it." Next was Lieutenant Carla Munro, now teaching engineering at the Naval Academy. Her voice trembled when Laura explained the purpose of her call. "You mean someone's finally clearing his name?" "Yes," Laura said quietly. "I'll be there, ma'am. You tell Captain Reynolds. He was the bravest pilot I ever saw." Each conversation left Laura a little more certain and a little more ashamed. For years, these people had carried the story of his heroism like a ghost no one wanted to hear. 2 days later, a small transport car pulled up outside the maintenance hangar. The clank of wrenches and the low hum of an engine greeted Laura as she stepped out. She was not in full dress uniform today, just her dark, navy service blue sleeves rolled hair tied back. Inside, Mike Reynolds was bent over a hydraulic pump grease, staining the cuffs of his coveralls. He didn't see her until she spoke. "Captain Reynolds." He looked up, blinking in surprise. "That title doesn't belong to me anymore, Admiral." "Maybe it does." He stood wiping his hands on a rag. "You found something." She held out a folder, the red seal broken. Enough to open a formal review. His expression didn't change, but his shoulders tightened. "Why, because justice doesn't expire," she said. "And because I owe you that much," he sighed, shaking his head. "You don't owe me anything, ma'am. You were following the book." "That's the problem," Laura replied softly. "I spent so many years following the book that I forgot why we wrote it, to protect people like you, not punish them." For a long moment, neither spoke. The echo of machinery filled the air. Then Mike set the wrench down. "What happens now? I've petitioned the Board of Naval Honors for a reinstatement of your commendations and a Medal of Valor review. You'll be summoned to D.C. for testimony within the week." He looked away, almost smiling. "You realize I don't fit in that world anymore, right? My boots don't even shine." She smiled faintly. "Courage doesn't scuff." At that, his composure cracked just a little. He exhaled, almost laughing at the absurdity of it all. 5 years. I'd stopped expecting the Navy to even remember I existed. "I didn't forget," she said quietly. "I just took too long to admit I was wrong." His gaze softened the resentment he might have felt, replaced by something else. Respect. Maybe even forgiveness. "Thank you, Admiral, for whatever this means." "It means everything," she said. "Not just for you, for me, too." That evening, Laura walked along the edge of the runway. The setting sun burned low over the horizon, its reflection turning the puddles of rainwater into molten gold. Her phone buzzed. A message from Ellis. "Board of Honors hearing confirmed. Pentagon Auditorium." Friday, so 900. She stared at the screen, her pulse steady but heavy. Then another message came through from an unknown number. Admiral Whitmore. This is Carla Monroe. The others and I will be there. We're bringing photos, reports, everything we kept. He deserves to stand tall again. Laura closed her eyes, the wind tugging gently at her uniform. For so long, her career had been built on absolutes, rules, carved in stone, right and wrong, defined by ink and rank. But now, standing on that empty runway, she realized that leadership wasn't about being infallible. It was about having the courage to face your own mistakes and repair the damage they caused, no matter how late. Across the base, Mike and Lily were eating dinner in their small apartment. She chattered about school, about spelling tests, and her best friend Emma, while he pretended to listen, his mind adrift. "Daddy, are you sad?" she asked suddenly. He blinked, caught off guard. "No, sweetheart. Why would you think that?" "Your eyes look like when it rains." He smiled faintly. "Maybe it's because something's changing." "Is it bad?" He shook his head. "No. I think it's something good." Lily smiled, satisfied with that answer. "Good things happen to good people. That's what Mommy used to say." His heart clenched. She was right. As he cleared the dishes, he looked toward the window. The lights of the base shimmered in the distance. For years, he'd learned to live with anonymity, to carry the quiet honor of someone forgotten. But now the idea that someone, the someone who'd once condemned him, was fighting to clear his name, stirred something in him he hadn't felt in years. Hope. Late that night, Laura sat at her desk once more, finalizing the paperwork. She paused before signing the last page, thinking of Mike's face when she handed him the folder. How he hadn't demanded anything, hadn't lashed out, hadn't once said, "You ruined my life." He'd simply said, "Thank you." That humility shamed her, but it also healed something deep within. She picked up her pen and signed with deliberate care, for courage beyond orders, for humanity beyond duty, for the honor of Captain Michael Reynolds. As she set the pen down, a thin smile crossed her face. Redemption wasn't loud. It didn't arrive with fanfare or speeches. It began quietly with an act of courage, and sometimes an act of apology. And in that quiet, Laura Whitmore finally understood that making amends could be as brave as commanding a fleet. Friday morning dawned clear over Washington, the kind of day the sky seemed to have scrubbed itself clean for. The marble steps of the Pentagon gleamed under the rising sun, and the air carried that hushed expectancy that precedes history. Inside, a small but formal ceremony was being prepared, not one for cameras or parades, but for truth. Rows of uniforms filled the modest auditorium. No media, no brass bands. Just the people who had lived the story and those who had come to correct it. At the center of the stage stood a single glass podium. Behind it, the Navy's flags hung motionless. On a small velvet cushion beside them rested a box, dark blue, sealed and simple. Inside lay a medal that had waited far too long to find its rightful owner. Admiral Laura Whitmore stood near the back of the room, watching the final arrangements. Her chest rose and fell with quiet restraint, but inside she felt a storm of emotion she could barely name. Shame, gratitude, redemption, and a kind of reverence. This wasn't just about righting a wrong. It was about restoring something sacred honor. A few minutes before the ceremony, Mike Reynolds arrived. He wore a clean shirt beneath his maintenance jacket and freshly polished boots. They weren't Navy issue anymore, but they gleamed nonetheless. His daughter Lily walked beside him, clutching his hand, her small fingers wrapped around the weight of something she didn't yet understand. As they stepped through the hallway, sailors and officers alike turned to look. Most of them didn't know who he was, just another man in civilian clothes, but the quiet murmur spread. That's him, the pilot from Cerberus. He stopped outside the auditorium doors, hesitating. The polished floors reflected his face back at him, older now, lines deeper hair streaked with gray. For a moment he thought of walking away. He had made peace with his past. He didn't need a ceremony to validate it. But then Lily looked up at him. "Daddy, are they giving you a medal?" He smiled faintly, something like that. "Mommy would be proud," she said softly. He swallowed the sudden ache in his throat. "Yeah, sweetheart." She would. They entered together. When the hall settled, Laura stepped up to the podium. Her uniform was immaculate, but her voice when it came was gentler than anyone had ever heard it. 5 years ago, she began a decision was made that should have been questioned. A man's record was marked not by what he did wrong, but by what others failed to see right. She paused, scanning the faces before her. That man was Captain Michael Reynolds. A murmur rippled through the room. Mike lowered his head, uncomfortable with the attention. Laura continued her words steady. During Operation Cerberus, Captain Reynolds disobeyed a direct order to withdraw. Instead, he turned back to rescue 5 personnel trapped behind enemy lines. His aircraft was damaged, his odds impossible. And yet he completed the mission and saved every one of them. She looked down at the report in her hands, though she no longer needed it. The Navy's code teaches that orders preserve life. But sometimes humanity demands courage beyond command. Captain Reynolds showed both, and we failed to honor that. Her voice softened. Today that changes. She gestured to her aide. The small blue box was brought forward and placed before her. The room seemed to hold its breath. "Captain Reynolds," she said, looking directly at him. "Will you please come forward?" He hesitated, then stood. His boots echoed softly as he approached the stage. Lily clung to his hand, but he gently squeezed her fingers and nodded for her to stay. When he stopped before her, Laura met his eyes, the same calm eyes she'd seen across an airplane aisle, the same man whose life she'd once unraveled with a signature. She opened the box. Inside gleamed the Navy and Marine Corps medal awarded for heroism, not involving actual conflict with the enemy, reserved for acts of extraordinary courage. Her voice trembled just slightly as she said, "For actions above and beyond the call of duty, for courage in the face of impossible odds, and for reminding us that honor belongs to those who choose humanity before hierarchy." Then carefully she pinned the medal to his chest. Their hands brushed just as they had when she had spilled coffee on that flight, and in that brief contact, both of them felt the same unspoken truth. Forgiveness doesn't need to be declared to be real. Applause filled the hall, not the thunderous kind reserved for parades, but something deeper, sincere, steady, reverent. Mike stood tall, but humble eyes glistening, jaw tight. He turned to the crowd, then back to Laura. "Thank you, Admiral." "I don't know what to say." "You already said it 5 years ago," she replied softly. "When you chose to go back." After the ceremony, the crowd dispersed slowly, each person reluctant to break the spell that had fallen over the room. Laura stepped aside, giving space to the people who now surrounded Mike, old comrades, from Cerberus officers who had served with him, even the engineers he'd saved. Some were older, some grayer, but all of them carried tears they didn't bother to hide. "Still cleaning up after the Navy, huh?" one of the engineers joked. Mike chuckled. "Someone's got to keep the floors shiny." Then he felt a small tug at his sleeve. Lily stood there, holding something behind her back. "What's that, sweetheart?" he asked. She brought it out, a simple paper drawing of 3 people standing under a sky full of stars. One wore a white hat. One, a green jacket, one had pigtails. At the top, in shaky letters, she'd written, "Daddy's medal makes the sky happy." Mike smiled, his throat tightening. "It sure does, kiddo." Laura watched from a distance, her chest full of something she couldn't quite name. Pride, perhaps. relief. Or maybe it was the quiet joy of seeing redemption become visible, something living and breathing and smiling in a child's hands. Later, when most of the attendees had gone, Mike approached her. "You didn't have to do all this," he said. "Yes, I did," she answered. He studied her for a moment. "You gave me back more than a medal, Admiral. You gave me back my name." She shook her head gently. "You never lost it, Reynolds. We just took too long to say it right." For a moment they stood in silence, the weight between them not heavy anymore, but balanced, like two halves of the same truth, finally meeting in the middle. As he turned to leave, she said, "Captain," he paused. "Your daughter," she said with a faint smile. "She's remarkable." He nodded, eyes warm. "She's her mother's courage, and my second chance." Laura returned the smile. "Take good care of both." "I will." He left the room, Lily skipping beside him, her laughter echoing down the corridor like music carried by sunlight. That night, Laura remained in the empty auditorium. The flag stood motionless, the podium silent. The metal case sat open, gleaming faintly under the dim lights. She closed her eyes and whispered, "You did it, Mike." And then, quieter still, "We did it." Outside, the first stars appeared over Washington. Somewhere far below, a single father carried his daughter home, the medal on his chest, glinting softly beneath the streetlights. The system had tried to erase his honor, but the truth had found its way back just as surely as kindness always does. The morning after the ceremony broke, soft and golden, the kind of sunlight that feels like grace. For once, the air around the Norfolk base carried no rush, no tension, only a sense of calm that seemed to hum through the hallways. The hangar, usually alive with the clatter of tools and the roar of engines, was quiet. Only the faint hum of a distant jet lingered like memory. Admiral Laura Whitmore walked across the tarmac, her heels clicking lightly against the cement. The wind tugged gently at her hair as she carried a plain white envelope in her hand, marked simply, "For Lily Reynolds." She could have sent it through official channels, but some things she had learned were not meant to pass through bureaucracy. They needed to be delivered heart to heart. Inside the maintenance hangar, Mike Reynolds was crouched beside an A-10's landing gear, tightening a bolt with careful precision. The same aircraft type he had once flown, now reduced to museum duty, its wings grounded its soul sleeping. When he heard footsteps behind him, he stood wiping grease from his hands. "Admiral." Laura smiled slightly. "Captain. You'll forgive me for not getting used to seeing you out of uniform." "Likewise," he said. She handed him the envelope. "For Lily." He frowned, curious, and turned it over. The handwriting on the front was careful, almost old-fashioned. "She's at school. Can I ask what this is?" "It's better if you read it together," Laura said. "It's something she and you both earned." He hesitated. "Ma'am, you've already done more than enough." "This isn't about favors, Mike," she replied gently. "It's about giving back what was always yours." There was a softness in her tone that unsettled him more than any command ever had. "I'll give it to her when she gets home," he said finally. Laura nodded. "Good." "And Mike?" "Yes." She paused, her voice quiet but resolute. "Thank you for reminding me what honor looks like when no one's watching." That evening, Lily came home from school, with her backpack bouncing and her shoes untied. The moment she saw the envelope on the kitchen table, her eyes lit up. "What's that?" Her father smiled. "Something for you, from Admiral Whitmore. From the lady who gave you the medal, that's the one." Lily tore the envelope open eagerly, scattering the pieces like confetti. Inside was a folded letter, on thick navy stationery, and a smaller envelope beneath it. The letter began in handwriting that was firm yet graceful. "Dear Lily, there are people who wear uniforms because it is their duty. Then there are people who carry honor in their hearts because it is who they are. Your father is one of those people. He taught me something I had forgotten, that courage doesn't always look like flying a plane. Sometimes, it looks like showing up every day for the ones you love, even when no one is saluting. Because of him, we created a scholarship in the Children of Honor program. It's meant for kids who remind the world that kindness and bravery come from the same place. You're the first name on that list. Keep shining, Lily. The sky is waiting for you. With admiration, Admiral Laura Whitmore. Lily's eyes widened as she finished reading. Daddy, does this mean I can go to school and learn about airplanes? Mike swallowed hard. The smaller envelope held an official certificate with her name embossed in gold. Lily Reynolds, recipient of the Children of Honor Scholarship. He had faced missiles loss and disgrace, but nothing had ever undone him like this moment. He blinked fast, pretending to study the letter again. She believes in you, he said softly. And she believes you'll do great things. Lily threw her arms around him. I'm gonna fly like you did, Daddy. He hugged her tightly, closing his eyes. Better than me, sweetheart. Much better. Later that night, after Lily had gone to bed, Mike stepped outside. The air was cool, the stars faint through a thin veil of mist. He stood by the fence that bordered the airfield, watching the ghostly silhouettes of the planes resting in the distance. The metal still lay on his kitchen counter, the polished metal catching the light from the lamp. But the paper on the table, the letter with his daughter's name, meant more. He thought of Laura, of the way she had stood on that stage, her voice steady, but her eyes holding the weight of 5 lost years. He thought of how she had chosen to face her mistake, rather than bury it, how she had traded reputation for redemption. Some debts couldn't be repaid. Some didn't need to be. He took a long breath and looked at the stars again. Thank you, he whispered. Across the base in her quarters, Laura sat at her desk. The day's ceremony had left her drained, yet strangely peaceful. On her wall hung a single new photo, a candid shot from earlier that morning, Mike standing with Lily, the metal shining faintly in the sunlight, both of them smiling. Beside it, a quote she had scribbled on a note card. Leadership isn't about authority. It's about responsibility. For years, she had worn medals for leading fleets and winning missions, but none of them felt as meaningful as the quiet act she had done today. She poured herself a cup of tea and opened her journal, a habit she had abandoned long ago. November 12th. Today I gave a scholarship to a little girl named Lily Reynolds. She smiled with the same light her father carries, the kind that doesn't fade, even after war loss or time. I've spent my life believing the Navy was built on discipline. Now I know it's built on people like them. I think my father would have called that faith. She closed the journal and leaned back, gazing out the window. The moonlight spilled across her desk, illuminating the words she had just written. And for the first time since she had joined the service, Laura Whitmore felt like she had truly earned her stars. The next day, Mike found a small package waiting outside his door. Inside was a brass plaque, engraved with the Navy insignia, and a short inscription presented to Captain Michael Reynolds, for courage that endured beyond orders, for a heart that never left the sky. He turned it over, smiling. Beneath the plaque was a handwritten note. For your daughter's wall, because she deserves to know what real honor looks like. LW. Mike chuckled softly. You just don't give up, do you, Admiral? But his voice was warm, now free of bitterness. He placed the plaque above Lily's desk, right next to her drawings of airplanes and stars. When she saw it the next morning, she whispered, "It looks like Mommy's watching." He knotted his throat tight. Maybe she is. And as the sunlight poured into their small apartment, catching the edge of the metal and the gold of the plaque, it felt just for a moment as if the whole sky had bowed in quiet acknowledgement. The Pentagon auditorium was full again, rows of medals and uniforms gleaming beneath the soft light. But this time, there was no ceremony, no citation, no applause waiting at the end. Only a podium, a microphone, and one woman who had something she could no longer keep to herself. Admiral Laura Whitmore stood backstage, her hands resting on the folder she had rewritten 3 times. She had delivered hundreds of speeches in her career, addresses about discipline leadership and the chain of command. But this one was different. This one was not about orders. It was about truth. "Ma'am," Commander Ellis whispered beside her. "The room's ready." "Press is not present per your request." She nodded. "Thank you, Ellis." He hesitated. "May I ask, why do this now?" "You've already cleared Reynolds's record. The medal was returned. The board has nothing left to contest." Laura looked out toward the gathered officers, the next generation of admirals, captains, and commanders waiting for words to guide them. Because medals fix paper, Commander. But truth repairs people. And there are still hearts that need that. Then she stepped forward. The hall fell into silence as she took the podium. Her voice, when it came, was steady, but unguarded, carrying the cadence of confession rather than command. "Good morning," she began. "Today isn't a briefing or an announcement. It's a story." She paused, scanning the faces before her, some curious, some skeptical, most unaware of where this was headed. 5 years ago, as a flag officer of the United States Navy, I signed an order that ended a man's career. His name was Captain Michael Reynolds, 33rd Squadron. A ripple of murmurs spread through the hall. Everyone knew the name now, but few expected her to speak it aloud. "He disobeyed a direct order during Operation Cerberus," she continued. "He turned back against command to rescue trapped engineers and enlisted personnel. The action saved 5 lives and cost him his wings." Her voice trembled just enough for the silence to deepen. I told myself I was doing my duty. That rules matter more than instinct, that the uniform means obedience above all. And for years, I believed that made me right. But a few weeks ago on a plane I wasn't even supposed to take, I met a little girl, his daughter. She spilled orange juice on my shoes. A soft chuckle rippled through the room. She apologized. Her father, quiet, kind, helped her clean up. I didn't know who he was then, just a janitor traveling with his child. But what struck me wasn't who he used to be. It was who he still was: calm, patient, decent. The kind of man the Navy says it wants to shape. She paused, breathing through the emotion rising in her chest. When I realized who he was, I looked back at his file. And for the first time in my career, I saw not a regulation, not a case study, but a person. A man who had chosen to risk punishment so that others could live. Her tone strengthened conviction, replacing tremor. That's what we claim to honor in our code: courage. Commitment, honor. But courage without compassion is just calculation. Commitment without conscience is just routine. Honor without forgiveness is just pride. The hall was utterly silent. Some of the older officers bowed their heads. Younger ones leaned forward, their faces open, listening not to a superior, but to a human being. Laura continued softly. "Captain Reynolds reminded me that leadership isn't about control. It's about service. It's about standing between others and the storm, even when no one will ever know your name. He did that, and we forgot him." She closed the folder, no longer needing her notes. "I am not proud of the mistake I made, but I am proud of the man who bore it with grace. I once punished him for following his heart. Today I thank him for teaching me how to find mine again." She stepped back from the podium. For a long heartbeat, the room remained still. Then quietly, then steadily, the audience rose to its feet. It wasn't applause that filled the air first, but silence, the kind reserved for fallen heroes or sacred truths. Then came the clapping, slow, deliberate building, like rain, until it became a storm of sound. Laura didn't bow. She simply nodded, eyes glistening heart-light, for the first time in years. Afterward, she lingered near the back doors, letting the younger officers approach her one by one. A lieutenant with nervous hands said, "Ma'am, I'll remember this more than any tactics course," a commander added quietly. "You just redefined what it means to lead." Laura smiled, shaking her head. "No, I just remembered what it means to be human." Then she turned, and there, standing in the doorway, as if he belonged to another world, was Mike Reynolds. He wore the same modest jacket, the same calm eyes. But now the medal she had returned to him glinted faintly in the light. "I wasn't sure you'd come," she said. "I almost didn't," he admitted. "Didn't think I belonged in a room full of stars." "You belong here more than anyone," she said softly. He smiled just enough for warmth to reach his eyes. "You did good up there, Admiral." "Thank you," she replied, "though I'm starting to think I'll never quite earn the rank you do." He raised an eyebrow. "What rank is that, Father?" she said simply. He chuckled. "That's one command you can't retire from." They shared a quiet moment, the kind that needed no words. Laura looked down. "You know, for years I gave speeches about duty and strength, but today was the first time I spoke from something real." "You found your flight path again," he said gently. "It happens to the best pilots." Her smile deepened. "Do you miss it?" "The sky," he hesitated. "Every day. But I don't need to fly anymore to know what freedom feels like." Laura nodded slowly. "I understand that now." A soft voice interrupted them. Daddy Lily ran up the aisle waving a small paper airplane. She stopped before Laura, offering it with both hands. "I made this for you, Admiral. Daddy says everyone who flies needs one." Laura crouched down, taking the tiny craft as if it were made of gold. "Thank you, Lily. I'll keep it on my desk." The girl grinned. "It's so you don't forget to smile." Laura's throat tightened. "I won't." She looked at Mike, her expression both professional and tender. "Take care of her. She's the best legacy the Navy ever produced." He nodded. "She's teaching me how to land again." And as they left together, the child between them, Laura stood watching an admiral without armor, a leader reborn through humility. That night in her private quarters, she placed the paper airplane beside the silver pen on her desk. Outside, the moonlight traced the edges of the Capitol dome and spilled over the Potomac like a promise. She whispered to the empty room, "Maybe honor was never about medals. Maybe it was always about the courage to change." For the first time in a long time, Admiral Laura Whitmore slept peacefully. Her conscience unburdened her heart, finally at ease. The sun was low over Norfolk, pouring its final light across the airfield like honey on steel. The wind came off the bay, carrying that mix of salt fuel and memory, the scent that never quite leaves anyone who has ever worn the uniform. Michael Reynolds stood beside his daughter Lily, near the perimeter fence of the Naval Museum grounds. In front of them, resting proudly on its landing gear, was an A-10 Thunderbolt, newly restored, repainted, reborn. Across the nose beneath the famous shark mouth glimmered a fresh nameplate in brushed, silver Reynolds wings. The dedication had been quiet, unannounced. No reporters, no generals. Just a handful of base staff, a few engineers he'd once saved, and a woman who had once carried the entire weight of her guilt in silence. That woman, Admiral Laura Whitmore, walked toward him now out of uniform for the first time since he'd met her. She wore a simple gray sweater, her hair loose in the wind, her stride slower, unguarded. For the first time, she looked not like a symbol of command, but simply like a person who had found her way home. "Looks good, doesn't it?" Mike said, eyes still on the aircraft. Laura stopped beside him, following his gaze. "It looks right," she said. "For too long, it was just a story buried in the system. Now it's where it belongs." Lily tugged on her father's hand. "Daddy, is that the plane you flew?" He nodded, smiling softly. "Not the same one, but close enough. This one's here to remind people that sometimes the sky remembers kindness better than paperwork does." Laura crouched beside the little girl. "And do you know why your daddy's plane has his name on it?" "Now?" Lily thought for a moment, then said, "Because he helped people." "That's right," Laura said. "Because he did something brave and good, even when it was hard." Lily's brow furrowed. "But Daddy said, being good is supposed to be easy." Laura glanced up at Mike, who was smiling, amused. "He's not wrong," she said. "It's supposed to be. The world just forgets sometimes." They stood in silence for a while, watching the sunset gild the A-10's wings. The aircraft seemed alive in that light, its metal skin catching fire, like memory turned to flame. Finally, Laura broke the silence. "There's one more thing," she said, reaching into her coat pocket. She drew out a small navy blue case, the kind that held rank insignias or medals, and opened it. Inside was a simple silver pin, shaped like a pair of wings, small enough to fit in a child's palm. "This belonged to a pilot I once knew," she said quietly. "He earned it when he was about your age, Lily. Maybe a little older." The girl's eyes widened as Laura held it out to her. "For me, for you," Laura said. "So that when you grow up, and when you fly, you'll remember something your father taught me, that kindness has wings too." Lily took it with both hands reverently. "I'll keep it forever." Mike swallowed hard, blinking away something in his eyes. "You didn't have to do that, Admiral." "I know," she said. "That's why it matters." They walked together along the edge of the field. The base was quieter now. Evening drills were over, and only the low thrum of a distant transport echoed from the far hangars. "Do you ever think about going back up?" Laura asked softly. He smiled wistfully. "Every day. But my flying days are over. The sky's got enough of my stories." "I don't think so," she said. "You left something up there, Mike. Not regret, just light." He looked at her, puzzled. "Light?" "Yes. The kind that stays long after the plane's gone. That's what people like you leave behind." He chuckled. "You sound more like a poet than an admiral." She shrugged, a playful glint in her eyes. "Maybe the Navy should promote one." They shared a quiet laugh, the kind born of everything they had already forgiven. When they reached the parking lot, Lily had run ahead, chasing the shadows of passing birds. "She's strong," Laura said. "Your wife would have been proud." Mike's smile softened. "She'd have liked you, you know. You're both the kind of people who'd argue with angels if it meant saving one more soul." Laura laughed, a sound lighter than she'd ever allowed herself. "That might be the best compliment I've ever been given." They stopped beside his truck. Neither seemed eager to end the moment. "Laura," he said, using her first name for the first time. "I don't know if you realize this, but what you did, it changed more than my record. It changed what my daughter will grow up believing about the world." She looked at him, her eyes luminous in the dusk. "Then it was worth everything." He nodded. It was. They shook hands, not the formal kind, but one that lingered, carrying the quiet weight of respect, gratitude, and something deeper. Neither dared name. Later that night, Laura returned to her quarters overlooking the harbor. She made tea, the simple ritual grounding her. The city lights reflected on the water, the faint hum of base life carrying through the glass. She sat at her desk, gazing at the folded letter. She had never mailed a letter to her late father. The man who had taught her that duty came before all else. She unfolded it now and picked up her pen. "Father, you always said honor wears a uniform. Maybe you were right in your time. But today, I met a man who showed me that honor also wears work boots and grease stains. I once believed the Navy was made of steel and rules. Now I know it's made of people flawed, brave, and beautiful in their imperfection. You'd have liked him, Dad. He reminds me of the kind of pilot you wished I'd meet, a quiet one, who never stopped believing in goodness, even when it broke him. I used to think redemption was a medal. Now I know it's a moment when two people forgive each other without words. Your daughter, Laura, she set the pen down, folded the paper, and slipped it into her journal. Outside, the faint rumble of an aircraft drifted through the night. She stepped onto the balcony, her eyes following the blinking lights as they climbed higher, leaving a thin white contrail across the stars. "Fly safe, Captain," she whispered. The next morning, Mike and Lily returned to the base for one final visit. A small crowd had gathered: maintenance workers, pilots, families curious to see the newly christened A-10. Someone handed Lily a bunch of white balloons. She grinned, tying one around the silver pin on her jacket. When the ribbon slipped free and the balloons lifted into the sky, the crowd cheered softly. The sight of them rising against the morning light, the same hue as courage and forgiveness, made everyone pause. As the last balloon disappeared into the blue, Lily whispered, "Look, Daddy." Mommy's waving back. Mike smiled through the lump in his throat. "Yeah, sweetheart. She is." And above them, the air seemed to shimmer, as if the sky itself was saying thank you. Later, when the crowd had gone, Laura approached him one last time. "You know," she said, "there's a saying my father used to tell me. Pilots never really land. They just trade one kind of sky for another." Mike looked toward the horizon, where the balloons had vanished. "Then maybe we both found ours." She smiled, extending her hand once more, not as an admiral to a subordinate, but as one soul to another. "Fair winds, Captain." He took it gently. "Clear skies, Admiral." And as they parted, the wind carried across the field, rustling through the grass, lifting faint echoes of laughter and brushing the wings of the A-10 like a benediction. For in that golden hour, kindness truly took flight, and for once, it didn't need an engine to soar. We'd love to know where you're watching from. Share your city or country in the comments below. It's always heartwarming to see how far these stories of kindness can travel. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more gentle, uplifting tales of courage, love, and second chances. Your support helps us keep bringing these moments of light to life. Thank you for spending your time with us today. Until the next story, stay kind, stay hopeful, and may peace find its way to your heart.